The autumn rain beats against my study window as I sit before this camera, my weathered hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of what I'm about to confess. My name is Helena Victoria Sterling, and I am 87 years old. For 73 years, I have carried secrets that would destroy lives, topple reputations, and rewrite the history of 3 counties in Mississippi. "Are you certain about this, grandmother?" Emma asks from behind the camera, her young face pale with worry. "Once you say these things, there's no taking them back." I look at her 24 law school graduate idealistic in the way only the young and privileged can be. She believes in justice systems, in due process, in the fundamental goodness of institutions. She has no idea that her comfortable world was built on a foundation of carefully orchestrated deaths. Some truths. I tell her, my voice still carrying traces of the Mississippi Delta, despite decades of careful cultivation, demand to be spoken before the grave claims them. My hands move instinctively to the mahogany box on my desk. Inside lies my grandmother's mortar and pestle, the instrument that changed everything. The wood is worn smooth by generations of use, stained dark, with herbs both healing and harmful. In its secret compartment, now empty, I once stored enough concentrated poison to kill a dozen men. I killed only 17, but those 17 deaths saved hundreds of lives. This is not a story of heroism. I continue, meeting Emma's horrified gaze. This is the confession of a monster, one born from necessity, shaped by brutality, and refined by years of calculated revenge. If you cannot stomach the truth about justice when law fails, stop recording now. Emma's hand hovers over the camera controls, but she doesn't press stop. She's always been curious about the shadows in our family's past, the unexplained wealth, the strange way certain names make older people in Millbrook fall silent. "Tell me," she whispers. And so I begin with February 14th, 1953, Valentine's Day. Though there was nothing loving about what happened that morning when I ground Jimson weed into Vincent Morrison's coffee and began my career as an angel of death. But to understand why I became what I am, you must first know what they made me into. I was born Helena Victoria Hayes in 1938 in the forgotten backwoods of rural Mississippi, where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a hereditary curse. When my father Samuel died of fever in 1950, leaving Mama Rose with 7 children and no means of survival, we learned that hunger is a patient predator always waiting. Our salvation appeared to arrive in September 1952, dressed in a pressed suit and driving a black Buick. Vincent Morrison owned the Grandview Inn in Millbrook, and he needed, he said, a bright young girl to help in his kitchen. She'll have her own room 3 meals a day and $5 monthly. Morrison promised, his voice smooth as honey over biscuits. There's even a school in town for continuing her education. The lie was perfect in its simplicity. Mama, desperate and trusting, saw only opportunity where I should have seen teeth. I packed my few belongings in a flour sack, 2 faded dresses, Mama's blessing, and my grandmother's mortar and pestle, the only valuable thing our family possessed. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother," Mama said, wrapping the wooden bowl in cloth. "She used it to make medicines that saved half the county during the cholera outbreak of 1887. It's got power in it, Helena. Respect that power." The Grandview Inn looked imposing from the road, 3 stories of white painted wood with wraparound porches that spoke of gracious southern hospitality. But like everything else in my young life, the facade concealed rot beneath. Inside, the paint peeled like diseased skin, the floors creaked ominous warnings, and the air hung thick with secrets and stale cigar smoke. Morrison led me to a windowless basement room containing 3 thin mattresses on a dirt floor. "You'll share quarters with the other girls," he said, his friendly mask already beginning to slip. "Sarah, Patricia, and Lucy, they'll teach you the rules." The other girls were ghosts of themselves. Sarah, 19, moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes vacant as winter ponds. Patricia, 16, flinched at every sound, her hands never quite steady. Lucy, barely my age at 14, had the hollow cheeks of starvation despite working in a kitchen. Rule 1. Sarah whispered to me that first night as we huddled on our mattresses. Never look the gentleman in the eyes. Rule 2. Do exactly what you're told when you're told. Rule 3. Forget you were ever anything more than what they say you are. What do they say we are? I asked. The three girls exchanged glances heavy with shared horror. Property, Patricia whispered, her voice breaking on the word. We're just property. My education in the true nature of the Grandview Inn began gradually like water slowly coming to boil. Morrison started by testing my boundaries, hands lingering too long, when he showed me tasks, comments about how I was growing into a young woman, observations about my natural beauty that made my skin crawl. The work was backbreaking, lighting fires before dawn, preparing meals for 12 to 15 guests, cleaning rooms, washing laundry in the creek behind the inn, serving dinner, scrubbing dishes until midnight. I worked 7 days a week for no pay. Morrison claimed I owed him for transportation, room and board. But the real horror began on the night of October 13th, 1952, under a blood-red harvest moon. Helena Way, Morrison called after the evening dishes were done. You'll be serving a private dinner tonight. Wear this. He handed me a dress I'd never seen, white cotton thin as gossip, cut far shorter than anything I'd ever worn. When I protested, his face transformed from fatherly concern to cold menace. You'll wear what I tell you to wear, girl. Unless you'd prefer to walk home through 60 miles of swamp and wolf-infested woods in the dark. The private dinner was held in Morrison's personal quarters upstairs. 5 men sat around a table, heavy with roasted meat, fine whiskey, and Cuban cigars, luxuries that seemed obscene after my months of near starvation. Morrison himself presided at the head, his bulk straining against a silk vest. To his right sat Colonel Raymond Bradley, the county's most powerful landowner, a skeletal man with pale eyes that seemed to see straight through clothing. Marcus Kane slouched across from him, a cattle dealer built like a prizefighter, his knuckles scarred from beating both animals and men into submission. Oliver Wells, the bank manager, appeared respectable in his pressed suit and wire-rimmed spectacles, but his smile held all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. And Dr. Edmund Cross, the town physician, sat silent and ashamed, though his presence made him complicit in whatever was to come. Gentlemen, Morrison announced as I served their whiskey with shaking hands. I present our newest acquisition, fresh from the countryside, unspoiled and eager to learn her proper place in the world. Colonel Bradley studied me with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. Very promising, Vincent. But is she ready for our particular brand of hospitality? She'll be ready tonight, Morrison replied, his hand falling possessively on my shoulder. Won't you, Helena? I didn't understand what they meant until Marcus Kane stood and locked the dining room door behind me. What happened next destroyed the 14-year-old girl named Helena Hayes. They took turns with me on Morrison's dining table, while the others watched and offered commentary like critics reviewing a theatrical performance. They photographed everything with Morrison's camera, telling me the pictures would follow me forever if I ever tried to escape or report what they'd done. I was 14 years old. I had never even held hands with a boy. When they finished, they left me broken and bleeding on the Persian rug, naked and shivering, while they discussed business over brandy, as if nothing had happened. Same time next month? Colonel Bradley asked, buttoning his shirt. Of course, Morrison replied. Though we'll have to train her better by then. She was far too resistant for proper hospitality. That night, lying on my thin mattress, while the other girls pretended to sleep, something fundamental died inside me. The innocent, hopeful child who had arrived 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. I would survive this, and someday, when I was strong enough and smart enough, I would make them pay for every violation, every humiliation, every moment of terror they had inflicted. The girl they had broken would become their executioner. The monthly gentlemen's dinners continued through the winter like a recurring nightmare. Each full moon brought fresh horrors as the 5 men grew more creative in their cruelty, more confident in their impunity. They owned the sheriff, controlled the judge, and commanded the respect of everyone who mattered in 3 counties. Patricia tried to run in January. They brought her back half dead from exposure and beat her so severely she couldn't work for 3 weeks. Morrison doubled her debt to pay for the medical attention Dr. Cross provided, the same Dr. Cross who participated in her abuse. Lucy simply stopped eating in March, choosing slow starvation over continued violation. When she died in her sleep, Morrison buried her behind the inn and told anyone who asked that she'd run away with a traveling salesman. I watched it all, learned from it all, and planned. But I was still just a 15-year-old girl, with no resources, no allies, and no knowledge of how to fight back against such powerful men. Then Rose Murphy arrived like Providence, wearing a traveling dress. She appeared at the inn on a rainy April evening in 1953, claiming to be an itinerant herb doctor seeking shelter. Rose was in her early 60s with steel gray hair and knowing eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. She paid for a room in advance and kept to herself, but I noticed her watching the staff with unusual intensity. On her second night, Rose found me crying in the kitchen after a particularly brutal session with Marcus Kane, who enjoyed inflicting pain as much as he enjoyed the violation itself. "Child," she said softly, approaching like one might approach a wounded animal. "What manner of hell is this place?" I couldn't speak. The words were trapped behind months of threats and terror. Rose examined my visible injuries with gentle, practiced hands, the finger-shaped bruises on my arms, the bite marks on my shoulders, the rope burns on my wrists from being restrained. "These weren't caused by kitchen accidents," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Someone has been systematically torturing you." Still, I remained silent. Morrison's threats echoed in my mind. "Try to tell anyone, and who do you think they'll believe? A respected businessman or a backwoods whore?" I'm going to tell you something," Rose continued, settling into a chair beside me. "I've spent 40 years traveling these roads helping women in impossible situations. I know the signs of systematic abuse, and I know what happens to girls who endure it. More importantly, I know how to stop it when the law refuses to act." She pressed a small piece of paper into my palm. "This is my address. I have a cottage on the outskirts of town. When you're ready to fight back instead of merely surviving, come find me." Rose left the next morning, but her words haunted my thoughts. Fight back instead of merely surviving. The possibility was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. 2 weeks later, when Morrison struck me unconscious for dropping a serving tray, I made my decision. That night, I slipped through the kitchen window and followed Rose's directions through the dark streets of Millbrook. Her cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane surrounded by gardens that seemed to grow in impossible abundance despite the poor soil. Rose opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been expecting me. "I wondered how long it would take," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "Are you ready to learn what real power looks like?" "I want them dead," I whispered, surprised by the venom in my own voice. "I want them all to suffer like they made us suffer." Rose nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting something that might have been satisfaction. "Then school is about to begin, child. But first you need to understand what kind of education you're truly asking for." Rose Murphy's cottage was a revelation, every surface covered with jars of dried herbs, bundles of plants hanging from hand-hewn beams, and books about botany and medicine that spoke of knowledge accumulated over decades. The air itself seemed alive with the scent of growing things and ancient wisdom. "Sit," Rose commanded, gesturing to a chair carved from what appeared to be a single piece of oak. "Tell me everything about these men. Don't omit any detail regardless of how painful or shameful it might seem." For 3 hours, I recounted every violation, every threat, every moment of terror I had endured. Rose listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her face growing harder with each revelation. "5 men," she said when I finished. "All powerful, all connected, all believing themselves untouchable. The sheriff is Colonel Bradley's nephew. The judge owes his position to Oliver Wells' financial backing. Dr. Cross delivers their wives' babies and treats their children's illnesses. Who would believe the word of a poor girl against such respectable pillars of the community? Rose stood and walked to her extensive collection of herbs, selecting several glass containers with practiced precision. Justice, she said, opening a jar filled with small white trumpet-shaped flowers, sometimes requires tools that civilized society prefers not to acknowledge. She held up one of the flowers. This is Jimson weed, also called devil's trumpet or thorn apple. In minute quantities properly prepared, it can ease pain and calm seizures. In larger doses, she paused meaningfully. It causes hallucinations, heart arrhythmia, respiratory failure, and eventually death. You're talking about poison? I said, my voice barely audible. I'm talking about justice when the law offers none, Rose corrected. But before you commit to this path, you must understand what it will cost you. Killing changes a person, Helena. It leaves marks on the soul that never fully heal. She moved to another jar containing what looked like black grain. Ergot. Grows on rye during wet seasons. Causes convulsions, hallucinations, and cardiovascular collapse. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire and blamed it on demons. Rose opened jar after jar, revealing an apothecary's worth of lethal knowledge. Foxglove for heart failure, castor beans for hemorrhaging, oleander for paralysis. Each plant had healing properties in proper doses, but in Rose's hands, they became instruments of precise execution. Why are you teaching me this? I asked as she demonstrated the proper techniques for drying and grinding various specimens. Rose was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands working a mortar and pestle, similar to my grandmother's. Because 30 years ago, I was where you are now. A young woman trapped by powerful men who believed they owned me body and soul. What happened to them? Rose's smile held no warmth. They had a series of most unfortunate accidents. Amazing how careless influential men become when the right plants find their way into their food and drink. Over the following months, Rose taught me everything. Identification of poisonous plants, proper harvesting techniques, methods of preparation and concentration. How to calculate lethal doses based on body weight and health conditions. How to create tinctures that were odorless and tasteless when properly diluted. Patience, she emphasized repeatedly, is your greatest weapon. Small doses over extended periods. Make deaths appear natural: heart attacks, strokes, liver failure. Give the body time to process each administration before the next. But Rose's lessons went beyond mere herbalism. She taught me about human psychology, about how to manipulate guilt and paranoia, how to turn a man's own vices against him. She showed me how to create new identities, how to move through society, invisible and unnoticed. You're not just learning to kill, she explained during one of our sessions. You're learning to become death itself, patient, inexorable, and impossible to escape. As summer turned to autumn, I noticed changes in myself that went beyond acquired knowledge. The constant fear that had defined my existence was being replaced by something colder and more calculating. I stopped flinching when Morrison struck me. I met the eyes of my abusers with steady, measuring gazes that seemed to unnerve them. The girl is changing, I overheard Colonel Bradley telling Morrison after one particularly brutal session. She's becoming unsettling. Broken in properly at last, Morrison replied with satisfaction. They all reach that point, eventually complete acceptance of their fate. If only they had known how wrong they were. By November 1953, I was ready to begin my campaign of justice. Rose had taught me to prepare Jimson weed extract that was virtually undetectable, colorless, and tasteless when properly diluted. The key was patience doses small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but accumulated over time to create systemic failure. Vincent Morrison would be first, both as the architect of my suffering and the most accessible target. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, he drank strong black coffee with 2 sugar cubes while reading his newspaper in the inn's main dining room. I had been serving him that coffee for over a year. He trusted me completely. On November 15, 1953, I added the first dose to Morrison's morning coffee, a barely visible amount of concentrated Jimson weed extract that dissolved completely when stirred. My hands were steady as I carried the tray to his table, my face composed in the mask of subservience he expected. Morrison drank his coffee without comment, absorbed in an article about cattle prices. I watched his face for any sign of reaction, but there was none. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my expression remained appropriately blank. For 2 weeks I continued the regimen, tiny additions to his morning coffee, that produced no immediate symptoms beyond mild fatigue, which Morrison attributed to the demands of running his establishment. Damned autumn weather, he complained to Dr. Cross during one of their conversations. Makes a man feel sluggish as molasses. On December 1st, I increased the dosage slightly. Within days, Morrison began experiencing persistent headaches and occasional dizziness. Must be my blood pressure, he told Colonel Bradley during their weekly meeting. Getting old, I suppose. By mid-December, Morrison's symptoms were impossible to ignore. His hands developed a noticeable tremor. His vision blurred sporadically. His legendary appetite vanished, and he began losing weight at an alarming rate. "Vincent, you look terrible," Oliver Wells observed during their monthly gathering. "When did you last see a physician?" Dr. Cross examined Morrison that same week, finding elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and neurological symptoms that defied easy diagnosis. "Could be stress-related," Cross concluded after running basic tests. "Running an establishment like this takes its toll. I recommend rest, perhaps a vacation." But Morrison was too paranoid about his business interests to leave the inn unattended. Instead, he increased his alcohol consumption, which only accelerated the poison's effects. By January 1954, Morrison was experiencing severe hallucinations. He would have conversations with people who weren't there, fly into rages over imagined slights, and spend hours staring at empty corners as if watching invisible dramas unfold. He's losing his mind," Sarah whispered to me one evening as we watched Morrison argue with his own reflection in the dining room mirror. "Good," I replied, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. On February 8, 1954, Vincent Morrison collapsed while screaming at Patricia for some perceived transgression. Dr. Cross pronounced him dead of massive heart failure, brought on by what appeared to be advanced cardiovascular disease complicated by neurological deterioration. The stress of his business finally overwhelmed his system, Cross explained to the assembled mourners at Morrison's funeral. "I warned him repeatedly about his lifestyle, but he wouldn't listen." As I served coffee at the funeral reception, the same coffee service that had delivered Morrison's death, I felt my first taste of true satisfaction. 1 down, 4 to go. But more importantly, I had discovered something about myself that would define the rest of my life. I was very good at killing, and I felt no remorse whatsoever about it. Morrison's death might have passed unnoticed, if not for the arrival of Detective James Crawford, a young investigator transferred to Millbrook from Jackson after exposing corruption in the state capitol. Crawford was 32 years old, methodical, incorruptible, and possessed of an analytical mind that saw patterns where others saw coincidence. He arrived in town 3 days after Morrison's funeral, officially assigned to investigate reports of bootlegging and illegal gambling. But Crawford was also curious about the circumstances surrounding Morrison's death, particularly the speed of his decline and the unusual combination of symptoms described by Dr. Cross. Heart failure in a man of 53. Crawford mused aloud while reviewing Morrison's medical records in Cross's office. Preceded by neurological symptoms, hallucinations, and rapid weight loss. It's an interesting presentation. Stress and poor living habits, Cross replied firmly. Morrison drank heavily, ate poorly, and worked himself into an early grave. I've seen it before. Crawford nodded, making notes in his leather-bound journal. I'm sure you have, Doctor. But I'm curious, have you seen many cases with this particular combination of symptoms? What are you implying? Cross asked, a note of defensiveness creeping into his voice. Nothing at all, Crawford said with a disarming smile. Just trying to understand the health challenges facing our community leaders. For instance, I understand Colonel Bradley has been experiencing some memory issues lately. Cross's face went pale. Bradley's declining mental state wasn't public knowledge yet, but Crawford had somehow learned about it within days of arriving in town. The colonel is getting older, Cross said carefully. Age affects everyone differently. Of course, Crawford agreed. Still, I hope he takes better care of himself than Morrison did. It would be tragic if another pillar of the community succumbed to similar health problems. After Crawford left, Cross immediately telephoned Colonel Bradley to warn him about the new detective's interest in Morrison's death. But the conversation was overheard by Millbrook's telephone operator, Mrs. Henderson, who had been paid by Crawford to monitor certain calls. Crawford was building a web of information, and I was beginning to realize that my campaign of justice had attracted the attention of someone far more dangerous than my intended victims. Colonel Raymond Bradley had survived 64 years through paranoia, ruthlessness, and an absolute conviction that power was the only protection against a hostile world. When Dr. Cross warned him about Detective Crawford's interest in Morrison's death, Bradley's response was swift and decisive. "Kill him," Bradley told Marcus Kane during a private meeting at the colonel's plantation. "Make it look like an accident, bandits maybe, or a fall from his horse." "Killing a detective brings heat," Kane objected. "Maybe we should just run him out of town." "Crawford isn't some local fool we can intimidate," Bradley replied. "I've made inquiries. The man's incorruptible, which makes him extremely dangerous to our interests." But before Kane could act on Bradley's orders, I accelerated my own timeline. The detective's investigation was getting too close to the truth, and I couldn't afford to let Bradley eliminate my only potential ally in law enforcement. Bradley's weakness was his pride. Despite his criminal activities, he maintained the facade of a Southern gentleman, which meant regular attendance at social functions where appearance mattered more than security. Every Sunday, Bradley attended First Baptist Church, sitting in the same oak pew his family had occupied for 3 generations. After services, he participated in fellowship hour, drinking coffee and eating pastries while networking with other prominent citizens. The church refreshments were provided by volunteer ladies on a rotating schedule. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery supplied coffee and pastries twice monthly, and I had been working for her since Morrison's death, spinning a story about being Morrison's orphaned ward in need of honest employment. "Such a tragedy about poor Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Patterson had said when I applied for work. "Leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back. Of course I'll give you a position, dear." Working at Patterson's bakery gave me access to the church fellowship supplies and detailed knowledge of everyone's preferences. "Colonel Bradley is particular about his coffee," Mrs. Patterson explained while preparing for Sunday service. "Real cream, never milk, and exactly 2 sugar cubes. He claims he can taste the difference between cane and beet sugar. Bradley's refined palate would be his downfall." I began adding Jimson weed extract to specially prepared sugar cubes reserved exclusively for the colonel's coffee doses, calculated for his larger frame and adjusted for the weekly intervals between exposures. The effects manifested more slowly than they had with Morrison, but by March 1954, Bradley was showing unmistakable signs of decline. His famous memory for names and faces began failing. His legendary temper became explosively unpredictable. "The colonel's not himself lately," Oliver Wells observed to Dr. Cross after church one Sunday. "Yesterday, he fired 3 field hands for looking at him wrong." "He's under tremendous stress," Cross replied. "The detective's investigation has everyone on edge." By April, Bradley's physical symptoms were undeniable. His hands shook constantly, making it difficult to sign documents or handle firearms. His speech occasionally slurred, and he sometimes forgot where he was mid-conversation. But the most dramatic change was psychological. Bradley became convinced that enemies surrounded him, servants plotting theft, neighbors coveting his land, business partners planning betrayal. He began sleeping with loaded pistols and refused to eat food he hadn't watched being prepared. "The colonel's becoming impossible to work with," Kane complained to Wells during one of their meetings. "He accused me of stealing cattle I sold him myself. The man's losing his mind." Detective Crawford, meanwhile, was taking careful note of Bradley's deterioration. He attended church services regularly, observing the colonel's behavior and documenting his decline in that leather journal. Fascinating how quickly the colonel's health has deteriorated. Crawford mentioned to Dr. Cross after one particularly dramatic Sunday service, where Bradley had loudly accused the minister of being in league with his enemies. Age and stress, Cross replied automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. Of course, Crawford agreed. Though it's remarkable how similar his symptoms are to those Morrison experienced before his death. Almost like they're suffering from the same condition. On May 15, 1954, during Sunday Fellowship Hour, Colonel Bradley suffered what appeared to be a massive stroke. He collapsed while reaching for his third cup of specially prepared coffee, convulsing violently before losing consciousness. Dr. Cross pronounced him dead at the hospital 3 hours later. Cerebrovascular accident brought on by hypertension and neurological degeneration. Cross told Detective Crawford when asked for the official cause of death. The stress of recent events finally overwhelmed his system. Crawford made detailed notes but said nothing. 2 down, 3 to go. But I was beginning to realize that Crawford's investigation was more sophisticated than I had initially understood. He wasn't just documenting deaths, he was building a case, gathering evidence, connecting patterns that I had thought were invisible. The game between us was about to become much more dangerous. Marcus Kane was different from Morrison and Bradley. Where they had been calculating predators, he was pure violence wrapped in human skin. Kane's brutality was legendary throughout 3 counties, bar fights that ended in death, business disputes settled with fists and boots, a reputation for cruelty that made grown men cross streets to avoid him. Kane was also the most dangerous of my targets because he was naturally suspicious and incredibly difficult to poison directly. He ate at different establishments, trusted no one to prepare his food, and had survived multiple assassination attempts by business rivals. But Kane had one exploitable weakness: his sexual appetites. Despite his fearsome reputation, Kane frequented a brothel on the poor side of town where desperate women sold themselves for survival. He preferred young girls who reminded him of his victims at Morrison's Inn, and his sessions were notorious for their brutality. I couldn't approach Kane directly, he would recognize me from the inn. But Rose Murphy had taught me more than herbalism. She had also shown me how to create entirely new identities when circumstances demanded it. I spent 2 months transforming myself, dyeing my hair from brown to auburn, using henna and walnut hulls, practicing a Louisiana accent I claimed to have inherited from a Creole grandmother, creating a complete backstory about fleeing New Orleans after my family died in a warehouse fire. The brothel's Madam Mrs. Celia Garrett was a hard woman who asked few questions about her girls' backgrounds. Desperation was qualification enough. "You're young and pretty," she said, examining me with calculating eyes. "But this isn't gentle work, honey. Some of these men have particular tastes that regular wives won't accommodate." "I can handle whatever they want," I replied, projecting the right mixture of desperation and determination. Mrs. Garrett nodded. "Kane comes every Thursday night, pays well but leaves marks. You sure you want this life?" "I don't have any other options," I lied convincingly. That Thursday, I waited in the room Kane always used, number 7, with its own entrance to avoid the common areas. I had prepared carefully grinding concentrated Jimson weed extract into face powder that matched my complexion. A single application to my neck and shoulders would transfer poison through skin contact. Kane arrived at 9 o'clock, already drunk and aggressive. He was massive, well over 6 feet tall, and built like the bulls he traded with scarred knuckles and cold eyes that promised pain. "You're new," he said, circling me like a predator evaluating prey. "I like breaking in fresh meat. I'm whatever you need me to be," I replied, using the sultry voice I had practiced for weeks. What happened next was horrific, but necessary. Kane's assault was every bit as brutal as I had expected. He derived pleasure from inflicting pain, from seeing fear in his victim's eyes. But this time, his violence served my purposes. Every blow transferred more poison to his system. Every moment of contact delivered concentrated death into his bloodstream. Kane left the brothel near midnight, staggering drunk and completely unaware that he was already dying. The concentrated dose I had administered was designed to mimic acute alcohol poisoning followed by organ failure, a believable progression for a man known throughout the region for his heavy drinking. Within hours, Kane was experiencing severe nausea, disorientation, and hallucinations. He attributed his symptoms to bad whiskey and continued drinking, which accelerated the poison's absorption. Over the following days, Kane's condition deteriorated rapidly. The Jimson weed attacked his nervous system, causing seizures, paranoid delusions, and cardiovascular collapse. Kane died alone in his hotel room on May 28, 1954, found 3 days later by a maid who had come to change the linens. The local physician attributed his death to acute liver failure brought on by chronic alcoholism. Dr. Cross, who examined the body when Kane's associates brought him home for burial, concurred with the diagnosis. "Marcus drank like a fish for 20 years, Cross told the assembled mourners. "I'm amazed his liver lasted as long as it did." But Detective Crawford was taking very careful notes. 3 powerful men, all associates of each other, all dead within 7 months of causes that appeared natural but shared unusual characteristics. "Interesting pattern," Crawford mentioned to Dr. Cross after Kane's funeral. 3 men all experiencing neurological symptoms before death, all dying of apparent organ failure. "Coincidence?" Cross replied, but his hands were shaking as he lit his pipe. "Perhaps," Crawford agreed. "Though I'm curious about something. I understand all 3 men were regular guests at Morrison's Inn. Did they share any common activities that might explain their similar health problems?" Cross went pale. "I wouldn't know about their private activities, Detective. I'm just a country doctor." Crawford smiled that disarming smile that never reached his eyes. "Of course, Doctor. Just trying to understand if there might be environmental factors affecting our community leaders. It would be tragic if others were at risk from whatever claimed these 3 men. 3 down, 2 to go." But Crawford was closing in on the truth, and I was beginning to realize that I might need to add his name to my list of necessary eliminations. Oliver Wells presented the most complex challenge yet. As Millbrook's bank manager, he was naturally paranoid and detail-oriented. He also had access to resources and information that could help him investigate patterns if he became suspicious. By summer 1954, Wells was definitely suspicious. 3 of his closest associates had died within 8 months, Morrison of heart failure, Bradley of a stroke, and Kane of liver failure. While each death appeared natural individually, the statistical probability troubled a man who understood numbers intimately. Wells began changing his routines, varying his routes to work, eating at different establishments each day. He hired bodyguards and had his food tasted before consuming anything. Direct poisoning was becoming nearly impossible. But Wells had one vulnerability: that his caution couldn't protect his absolute devotion to his elderly mother. Mrs. Constance Wells lived in Millbrook's only nursing home, suffering from dementia that left her confused and frightened most of the time. Every Sunday without fail, Oliver visited her for exactly 1 hour, bringing the same gift, a box of chocolates from Patterson's Bakery. The chocolates were one of the few things that could still bring joy to Mrs. Wells' deteriorating mind. She would examine each piece carefully before selecting her favorites, her face lighting up with childlike pleasure. "Such a devoted son," the nursing staff would say. "Never misses a visit, always brings her those special chocolates." Working at Patterson's Bakery gave me access to Wells' weekly order and knowledge that he personally selected each chocolate for his mother's box. He was particular about the assortment, always requesting the same combination of flavors, arranged in a specific pattern that had been his mother's preference since childhood. I began preparing special chocolates for Mrs. Wells' dark chocolate truffles infused with carefully measured doses of concentrated foxglove extract. The bitter chocolate completely masked any taste of the poison, and the small size allowed for precise dosing. The cruel genius of my plan was psychological. Wells would blame himself for his mother's death, adding guilt to grief in a combination designed to destroy his mental stability. On June 20th, 1954, Mrs. Wells consumed 3 of the poisoned chocolates during her son's visit. The foxglove extract was calculated to cause apparent heart failure within hours, a common and unsuspicious cause of death among elderly patients with dementia. Mrs. Wells died peacefully in her sleep that night, found the next morning by nursing staff, who assumed she had simply passed away naturally. Wells was devastated beyond reason. He had brought those chocolates to his mother every Sunday for 4 years, watching her face transform with joy as she made her selections. The guilt consumed him completely. "I killed her," he sobbed to Dr. Cross during the funeral arrangements. "Those chocolates. What if something was wrong with them?" "Oliver, your mother was 84 years old with severe dementia," Cross replied gently. "Her heart simply gave out. It's a blessing she's no longer confused or frightened." But Wells couldn't accept the rational explanation. His banker's mind demanded accountability, and he was the only person who could be held responsible for his mother's final meal. Wells had the remaining chocolates analyzed by 3 different laboratories. All tests returned negative results. Foxglove extract metabolized completely within hours, leaving no detectable traces. The negative results only increased Wells' guilt and paranoia. If the chocolates weren't contaminated, then his mother had died because he had somehow failed her. His work at the bank suffered as he became obsessed with reviewing every detail of her death. Within weeks, Wells was drinking heavily, sleeping poorly, and showing signs of complete psychological breakdown. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that someone was systematically targeting his circle, but unable to identify the threat. Detective Crawford watched Wells's deterioration with professional interest, documenting his behavior and making connections that were becoming impossible to ignore. 4 deaths in 9 months. Crawford mentioned to his supervisor during one of their telephone conversations. All men connected to Morrison's Inn, all dying of apparent natural causes after exhibiting similar neurological symptoms. "You think someone's killing them?" his supervisor asked. "I think someone very clever is eliminating specific targets using methods designed to appear natural," Crawford replied. "The question is who and why." On August 15, 1954, Oliver Wells placed the barrel of a .38 revolver against his temple in his office at the bank and pulled the trigger. His suicide note mentioned overwhelming guilt about his mother's death and paranoid fears that he was losing his mind. He wrote about seeing the faces of people he had wronged, though he didn't identify them specifically. Dr. Cross ruled it suicide brought on by grief and mental deterioration. 4, down 1 to go. But Detective Crawford was no longer just observing, he was actively investigating, and his attention was beginning to focus on the one element common to all 4 deaths, the Grand View Inn and its staff. Detective James Crawford had spent 6 months methodically building a case that defied conventional law enforcement wisdom. 4 prominent men, all associates, all dead within 10 months of causes that appeared natural, but shared disturbing similarities. Crawford's investigation had revealed the connection. All 4 men had been regular participants in what witnesses described as private dinners at Morrison's Inn gatherings that seemed to involve the systematic abuse of young female staff members. The problem was evidence. Everyone who might testify was either dead, disappeared, or too terrified to speak. The surviving inn staff had scattered after Morrison's death, some returning to families, others vanishing entirely into the anonymous masses of displaced persons that characterized post-war America. Crawford had managed to locate 2 former employees, Sarah, who was working as a seamstress in Mobile under an assumed name, and Patricia, who had returned to her family's farm in rural Alabama. Both women confirmed the pattern of abuse, but refused to provide formal statements. "They're all dead now," Sarah told Crawford during their clandestine meeting in a mobile coffee shop. "Whoever killed them, I hope they burn in hell slowly. But I won't testify against someone who delivered the justice the law never would." Patricia was even less cooperative. "I don't know nothing about nothing," she insisted when Crawford visited her family's farm. "And I don't want to know. Some sleeping dogs should stay sleeping." Crawford's frustration was mounting. He knew a serial killer was operating in Millbrook, someone with sophisticated knowledge of poisons and human psychology. But without witnesses or physical evidence, he couldn't make arrests. That's when he decided to focus on the one element he could investigate: the current staff at locations where the victims had been poisoned. Patterson's Bakery had provided refreshments for Colonel Bradley's final church service. The brothel where Kane died had employed a mysterious girl who disappeared immediately after his death. Morrison's coffee had been served by inn staff who seemed to vanish like morning mist. Crawford began constructing a profile of his killer-intelligent patient, methodical with access to rare poisons and the ability to create false identities. Most likely someone with personal motivation for targeting these specific men. His investigation led him inevitably to me. I first became aware of Crawford's focused attention on a Tuesday morning in September 1954, when Mrs. Patterson mentioned that the detective had been asking questions about her employees. "He wanted to know about you specifically, Helena," she said while we prepared the day's bread. "Asked when you started working here, where you came from, whether you had any connection to the Grandview Inn." My blood ran cold, but my expression remained perfectly composed. "What did you tell him?" "The truth that you came to me after poor Mr. Morrison died needing honest work. That you're a good girl who's had more than her share of troubles." Mrs. Patterson paused in her kneading. "Is there something I should know, dear?" "Detective Crawford seems to think there's some connection between Mr. Morrison's death and the others," I said carefully. "I suppose he has to investigate every possibility, no matter how unlikely." But I knew Crawford was closing in. That evening, I met with Rose Murphy at her cottage to discuss the situation. "He's building a case," Rose said, after I described Crawford's investigation. "Methodically, carefully, the way a good hunter tracks dangerous prey." "What should I do?" I asked. Rose was quiet for several minutes, grinding herbs in her mortar and pestle with slow, deliberate strokes. "There are two options," she finally said. "Run or eliminate the threat. Run where Crawford has resources I can't match. If he's convinced I'm his killer, he'll find me eventually." "Then you know what needs to be done," Rose said. "But killing a law enforcement officer brings risks that our previous targets didn't. The investigation will be extensive. Federal authorities might become involved." "Do you have something that could work?" I asked. Rose opened a cabinet I had never seen her access before, removing a small vial filled with clear liquid. "Ricin," she said. "Extracted from castor beans. Absolutely lethal, virtually undetectable, causes symptoms that mimic natural illness." "How would I administer it?" "That," Rose said with a grim smile, "requires some creativity." Crawford made his first direct approach 3 days later, appearing at Patterson's Bakery during the afternoon lull when I was working alone. "Miss Helena Hayes," he said, studying me with those analytical eyes. "Or do you prefer another name these days?" "I don't know what you mean, Detective Worrell," I replied, continuing to arrange pastries in the display case. "I think you do," Crawford said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "I've been investigating the deaths of 4 men who all shared certain interests at Morrison's Inn. Interesting how their deaths coincided with the arrival and movements of various young women in our community. Terrible tragedies," I agreed. "Though I understand they all lived very unhealthy lifestyles." Crawford smiled that cold smile. "Indeed, stress, poor diet, excessive drinking, almost as if someone who understood their habits was exploiting those weaknesses." We studied each other across the counter like chess players evaluating positions. Crawford knew I was his killer, but he lacked proof. I knew he was a threat that needed elimination, but he was too careful for direct action. "I'd like to order a special cake," Crawford said eventually. "Something for my mother's birthday next week. She has very particular tastes." "Of course, Detective. What kind of cake does she prefer?" "Chocolate layer cake with vanilla buttercream frosting," he said. "My mother always said the secret to good chocolate cake was using the finest ingredients." "I'll make sure it's perfect," I promised. "When do you need it?" "Next Friday evening. I'll pick it up personally." Crawford stood to leave, then paused. "You know, Miss Hayes, I've always believed that justice finds a way. Sometimes through the law, sometimes through other means." After he left, I realized Crawford had just issued both a challenge and a warning. He knew what I was, but he also understood why I had become it. The question was whether his sense of legal duty would overcome his recognition that my victims had deserved their fates. I spent the next week preparing carefully. Crawford's mother's birthday cake would indeed be special, infused with enough ricin to kill a horse disguised within layers of rich chocolate that would mask any bitter aftertaste. But I also prepared for the possibility that Crawford might not consume the cake himself. Ricin took hours to become symptomatic, giving him time to have it tested if he suspected poison. I needed a backup plan. Dr. Edmund Cross was the last of my original targets, but his death would have to wait. Crawford's investigation had accelerated my timeline, forcing me to choose between completing my revenge and ensuring my own survival. I chose survival. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable rain that turned Millbrook streets into rivers of red mud. Crawford appeared at Patterson's bakery precisely at 6 o'clock alone and apparently unarmed. "Is my mother's cake ready?" he asked. "Of course, Detective." I brought the cake from the kitchen, 3 layers of chocolate perfection that contained enough ricin to kill him within hours of consumption. Crawford examined the cake with apparent satisfaction. "It looks perfect. My mother will be delighted. I hope she enjoys it," I said sincerely. "Oh, I'm sure she will," Crawford replied. "Though I should mention my mother died 5 years ago. Cancer." My blood turned to ice, but my expression remained composed. "I'm sorry for your loss, Detective." "How are you?" Crawford asked. "Because I suspect you understand loss better than most people. The loss of innocence, of childhood, of hope." We stood in silence for several heartbeats, the poisoned cake sitting between us like an accusation. "I know what those men did to you," Crawford said quietly. "I know about the monthly gatherings, the systematic abuse, the photographs they used to ensure your silence. I know because I've spent months interviewing other survivors, piecing together the full scope of their crimes." "And what do you intend to do with that knowledge?" I asked. "That depends," Crawford replied, "on what you intend to do next." I don't understand." Crawford reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder. "Documented evidence of systematic sexual abuse, human trafficking, murder, and corruption involving Morrison, Bradley, Kane, Wells, and Dr. Cross. Enough to convict them all if they were still alive." He placed the folder on the counter beside the poisoned cake. "The question is whether their deaths constitute justice or murder." I stared at the folder, understanding finally dawning. "You've known from the beginning." "I suspected from the moment I arrived in Millbrook," Crawford confirmed. 4 powerful men, all dying of apparent natural causes, all connected to a pattern of abuse that the local authorities had systematically ignored. It wasn't difficult to identify the most likely perpetrator. "Then why haven't you arrested me?" Crawford was quiet for a long moment. "Because arresting you would require explaining why these men died, which would mean revealing what they did to you and dozens of other girls. Their victims would be subjected to public scrutiny, cross-examination, character assassination. Justice for you would mean destroying the lives of everyone you were trying to protect. So what do you propose?" "A deal," Crawford said. "The killing stops here. Dr. Cross lives along with anyone else who might have been involved in their activities. In exchange, this investigation ends with the conclusion that 4 corrupt men died of natural causes brought on by their own poor lifestyle choices." I considered his offer carefully. Cross was the last of my original targets, but Crawford was right about the broader implications. Pursuing complete revenge would destroy the very people I had been trying to save. "And if I refuse your deal, then I arrest you for murder and let the justice system decide whether your actions were legally justified," Crawford replied. "Given the evidence of what those men did, a jury might even acquit you, but the trial would destroy everyone involved." Crawford had outmaneuvered me completely. He understood that my motivation had always been protection, not mere revenge. He was offering me the chance to end my campaign with my objectives largely achieved and my secrets intact. "Dr. Cross lives," I said finally. "Dr. Cross lives," Crawford agreed. "But Helena Hayes disappears forever? No more false identities, no more vigilante justice. You find a new life far from here and never return to this kind of work." "And the cake?" Crawford smiled genuinely for the first time since I had met him. "I'll dispose of it safely, along with any other Materials you might have prepared. That night, I gathered my few possessions and prepared to leave Millbrook forever. Rose Murphy helped me create a final new identity. Helena Victoria Sterling, orphaned daughter of a Louisiana plantation family, traveling north to start fresh after losing everything in a hurricane. You did what needed doing, Rose told me as we burned the evidence of my true identity in her fireplace. 4 monsters are dead, and dozens of women are safer because of your actions. Was it worth it? I asked. Rose considered the question seriously. That's not for me to judge. But I will say this: the world is a better place without those men in it. I never saw Detective Crawford or Rose Murphy again. But I kept my bargain. Dr. Cross lived out his remaining years in Millbrook, eventually dying of natural causes in 1967. I moved north, establishing a new life based on the culinary skills Rose had taught me, alongside her deadlier lessons. The girl who had been Helena Hayes was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes justice required methods that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge. Helena Victoria Sterling emerged in Chicago in late 1954, a young woman with excellent references, remarkable culinary skills, and a mysterious past that she preferred not to discuss. I had learned to reinvent myself completely: new accent, new mannerisms, new dreams that bore no resemblance to the nightmares I had left behind in Mississippi. I found work at Romano's, an upscale restaurant owned by an Italian immigrant family who appreciated skill over pedigree. Within 2 years, I was head chef. Within 5, I had saved enough money to open my own establishment. Sterling's became Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, famous for cuisine that seemed to capture something indefinable, a combination of Southern comfort and European sophistication that food critics described as hauntingly memorable. What they didn't know was that my dishes carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom about survival sacrifice and the price of justice. But success couldn't silence the ghosts that haunted my sleep. Every night I relived the violations at Morrison's Inn. Every day I wondered if I had truly served justice or simply become another monster in an endless cycle of violence. The doubts grew worse with time. I found myself studying my customers, identifying those who reminded me of my victims. The wealthy businessman who treated his young secretary with casual cruelty. The politician whose wife wore makeup that didn't quite conceal finger-shaped bruises. The judge whose reputation for leniency toward domestic violence cases was legendary among defense attorneys. I began to understand that my work was far from finished. Morrison's Inn had been just one nexus of abuse in a world filled with predators who believed their power made them untouchable. So I expanded my mission. By 1965, I owned 3 restaurants and had established the Sterling Foundation, officially dedicated to providing culinary training and employment opportunities for disadvantaged women. Unofficially, it was a sophisticated operation for identifying, protecting, and when necessary eliminating threats to vulnerable people. I recruited carefully women who had survived their own hells, who understood that sometimes the system failed so completely that justice required extra-legal methods. Former prostitutes who knew how to read dangerous men. Abuse survivors who carried their own grudges. Women with access to powerful men's private moments. We developed techniques that made my early poisoning attempts seem primitive by comparison. Psychological manipulation that drove targets to self-destruction. Social engineering that destroyed reputations and careers. Financial warfare that left enemies bankrupt and powerless. And when subtler methods failed, we still had Rose Murphy's botanical lessons. Ricin in restaurant meals, foxglove in morning coffee, oleander extract in expensive cigars. Deaths that appeared natural to even sophisticated autopsies. Over 20 years, my network eliminated 47 men who preyed on women and children. We saved hundreds of lives by ending dozens of others. But the killing changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each death became easier, more mechanical. I stopped feeling satisfaction in my victim's suffering and began to experience only cold efficiency. I was becoming something that frightened even me, a perfect predator, emotionally disconnected from the violence I orchestrated. The realization that I had become a monster came in 1982 when one of my operations went wrong. Thomas Hartwell was a federal judge with a reputation for leniency toward wealthy defendants and harshness toward women who dared to accuse powerful men of sexual assault. My intelligence network had identified him as responsible for dozens of victims never receiving justice. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Hartwell would suffer a heart attack during a dinner at one of my restaurants, apparently brought on by his pre-existing cardiovascular conditions and exacerbated by rich food and alcohol. What I didn't know was that Hartwell's daughter would be dining with him that evening, a young lawyer named Rebecca, who was secretly gathering evidence of her father's corruption, planning to expose him through legal channels rather than vigilante justice. Rebecca saw her father collapse and immediately began CPR, frantically trying to save a man she despised but still loved. She worked over his body for 20 minutes before the ambulance arrived, tears streaming down her face as she begged him not to die. I watched from the kitchen doorway, seeing in Rebecca's grief a reflection of every daughter who had ever loved a monster. Every child who had been failed by the adults sworn to protect them. Hartwell died despite Rebecca's efforts, and she inherited his judicial papers. Among them, she found detailed records of bribes accepted, verdicts purchased, and women's lives destroyed for the benefit of his wealthy patrons. Rebecca used those records to expose a corruption network that sent dozens of criminals to prison and freed many wrongly convicted victims. Her father's death had accomplished more good through legal channels than my murder ever could have achieved alone. But it had also destroyed an innocent woman's faith in justice and family. Rebecca became a crusader for legal reform, but she also became hard, cynical, emotionally unavailable to relationships or joy. She had saved others by sacrificing her own capacity for happiness. I realized then that my methods created casualties beyond my intended targets. Every death sent ripples through families and communities, harming innocent people who had the misfortune to love monsters. The girl who had started this campaign to protect the innocent had become someone who destroyed innocence as collateral damage in her war against evil. The confrontation with my own nature came gradually through small moments that accumulated like poison in the soul. A widow weeping at her abusive husband's funeral, genuinely mourning despite her bruises. A child asking why Daddy wouldn't wake up, unaware that Daddy had been paying to rape other children. A mother defending her son's reputation even after his victims came forward, unable to reconcile the man who kissed her goodnight with the monster who destroyed lives. I began to understand that the world wasn't divided neatly between good people and evil ones. Most humans existed in moral gray areas capable of both tremendous cruelty and unexpected kindness. My victims had been fathers and sons, employers and community leaders. Their deaths had consequences I couldn't predict or control, but the deeper horror was recognizing what I had become. 70 years of justified killing had created someone who could end a life without emotional response, who viewed human beings as problems to be solved, rather than complex individuals deserving compassion. I was no longer the frightened girl seeking justice. I had become the thing that girls like her needed protection from. The realization should have stopped me. Instead, it made me more careful about target selection, more sophisticated in my methods, more emotionally distant from the consequences of my actions. I continued killing because it was what I knew how to do, because stopping would mean confronting the full weight of what I had become. By 2010, I had been directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of over 200 people. Some had deserved their fates, others had been collateral damage. A few might have been innocent entirely. Intelligence isn't perfect, and monsters are skilled at disguising themselves as victims. I told myself that the mathematics favored my methods, hundreds of lives saved through dozens of deaths. But mathematics couldn't account for the human cost of becoming someone capable of such calculations. Now, at 87, sitting before this camera with my granddaughter Emma, recording every word, I finally confront the full truth of what I became and what it cost. "You're describing mass murder," Emma says, when I finish recounting 7 decades of killing. Her voice shakes with horror and something that might be admiration. "Grandmother, you're confessing to being a serial killer." "I'm confessing to being what the world made me," I reply. A frightened girl who learned that sometimes justice requires tools that civilized society prefers not to acknowledge. "But the people you killed, they had families, children, people who loved them despite their crimes." "Yes, I agree. And their victims had families too. Children who grew up believing themselves worthless because monsters convinced them that abuse was love. Mothers who died trying to protect daughters from fathers who should have been protectors." Emma struggles to process the moral complexity. "But couldn't you have found other ways, legal channels, social services, advocacy groups?" "Mo. Child, you live in a world I helped create, one where women can report abuse without destroying their own lives, where children's testimony is believed, where the wealthy face consequences for their crimes. That world didn't exist when I was young. I helped build it through methods you find horrifying now." "Was it worth it?" Emma asks quietly. "All the killing, all the deception, all the years of living with these secrets." I consider her question carefully, as I have considered it every day for 73 years. "I saved lives," I say finally. "Hundreds of women and children who lived because I eliminated the men who would have destroyed them. I built networks that continue protecting vulnerable people long after my personal war ended. I created institutions that provide real alternatives to violence for women facing impossible situations. But I also became something monstrous in the process. I lost the ability to feel genuine human connection. I view every relationship as either strategic advantage or potential threat. I've lived my entire adult life as a carefully constructed lie, never allowing anyone to know my true nature." Emma is quiet for several minutes, processing the weight of my confession. "What happens now?" she asks eventually. "Do I report this to authorities? Do I keep your secrets? Do I continue your work?" "That choice is yours to make," I tell her. "But understand this: whatever path you choose will change you fundamentally. Knowledge like this carries a price that can never be fully paid." Emma reaches across the desk and takes my weathered hand in her smooth young one. "Tell me one thing honestly, grandmother. Given everything you know now, all the costs and consequences, would you make the same choices again?" I look into her earnest young face, seeing echoes of my own features softened by decades of privilege and protection I helped provide. She deserves the truth, even if it destroys her faith in justice and family. "Every single time," I whisper. Even knowing what I would become, even understanding the full price of justice, I would kill them all again. The confession hangs between us like a curse and a blessing, the final truth of what love becomes when the world offers no other options for protection. Emma releases my hand and turns off the camera, ending the recording, but not the questions that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Outside, winter rain continues to fall on the city I helped shape through 7 decades of careful violence. Somewhere in the darkness, new monsters are creating new victims, and new protectors are learning that sometimes justice requires methods that civilized society prefers not to acknowledge. The cycle continues as it always has, as it always will. The only question is whether each generation will have the courage to pay the price that protection demands, and the wisdom to understand what that payment costs. I am Helena Victoria Sterling. I was born a victim and chose to become something else entirely. History will judge whether I became a hero or a monster. But the children who grew up safe because of my choices won't care about history's verdict. And neither in the end do I. Epilogue: The Weight of Secrets. Emma Sterling Monroe sits in her grandmother's study 3 days after the funeral, surrounded by legal documents and family photographs that suddenly carry new and sinister meanings. The old woman died peacefully in her sleep, taking with her the specific locations of bodies, the names of victims, the detailed methods of 7 decades worth of perfectly orchestrated murders. But she left behind more than secrets. Emma has discovered bank accounts containing millions of dollars property deeds for safe houses in 12 states, and contact information for a network of women whose names she recognizes from newspapers, successful businesswomen, philanthropists, political activists, all quietly working to protect vulnerable people through methods both legal and otherwise. The Sterling Foundation continues its work, providing genuine opportunities for disadvantaged women, while serving as cover for activities that authorities prefer not to investigate too closely. Emma now holds controlling interest in an organization that has saved thousands of lives through methods she is only beginning to understand. On her desk lies the mahogany box containing her grandmother's mortar and pestle, along with a sealed letter marked, "For Emma to be opened only if you choose to continue the work." Emma has not yet opened the letter. She suspects it contains specific instructions for carrying on Helena's legacy names of targets who still need elimination methods for avoiding detection contacts within law enforcement, who understand the necessity of extralegal justice. The choice before her is simple and terrible: embrace her inheritance as both protector and predator, or walk away and leave vulnerable people without the protection that only violence can sometimes provide. Outside her window, Chicago's streets teem with predators and victims, monsters, and innocent people who believe in justice, and people who create the necessity for revenge. Emma picks up the sealed letter, feeling its weight in her hands, not just the paper and ink, but the accumulated choices of generations of women who discovered that sometimes protection requires becoming the very thing that others need protection from. She does not yet know which choice she will make. But she understands now that some decisions change not just individual lives, but the fundamental nature of who we become when the world demands more than we thought ourselves capable of giving. The letter remains unopened, for now. But winter is ending, and spring brings new growth, including new monsters, new victims, and new opportunities for the kind of justice that courtrooms cannot provide. The mortar and pestle waits patiently on Emma's desk, worn smooth by generations of use, ready to serve whatever purpose the next generation chooses for it. Some inheritances are legacies, others are curses. Emma Sterling Monroe is about to discover which kind her grandmother left behind.